Unprecedented times call for unprecedented live streaming schedules, so we're back for a late night show with Jared Beck. Jared, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jason. It's always good to be here.
It's always good to have you here, Jared, and it's nice to have you with your you've got the COVID-19 quaff going, which I may have to join you in that tight cropped hairstyle since the dictatorial governor, and I put the emphasis on Dick, has basically shut down the entire city and frankly the entire state by decree. As I travel around, Jared, there are even some retail stores, I'm thinking it was CVS or Rite Aid, had a sign that said, you're not allowed in the store, that it's the law you must wear a medical mask. I think that was a mistake on the part of the store, but what is going on? Are the governor's executive decisions laws?
Well, they're certainly acting as if, and it's not all states, by the way. Some states are handling this coronavirus phenomenon differently than others, but we're certainly seeing some states' governors acting as if they have a license to rule by decree in this pandemic. And I think that's exactly what they're trying to do.
But do they have the legal authority to do it is really the question that I want to explore. And, you and I were on the phone earlier. There really is no legal precedent for exactly this because it's an unprecedented situation. But the question that I pose is, can any legal action be taken by citizens or perhaps other members of the government to compel the governor and subsequently the NYPD to uphold the Constitution? Where would we look for something like this?
Well, absolutely. And in fact, there are actions being taken. I know that cases have been filed in Pennsylvania challenging the governor's ability to issue sweeping shutdown and lockdown orders during this pandemic or purported pandemic. I know that there's litigation that's already started in Florida, where I'm based, and I've been approached by people interested in filing suit. There's litigation activity in Texas, where that hair salon owner was actually thrown in jail. And she challenged the trial judge's sentencing of her all the way up to the Supreme Court. And I think somebody there, it may have been the attorney general, actually had some scathing words for the judge. So that's another way it can be challenged as well, is in the criminal process. But I think we're seeing a lot of direct challenges now brought by stakeholders, which are probably going to be businesses for the most part, which are losing money if they're declared non-essential and not able to operate during a shutdown. So we're seeing direct challenges to the authority of these governors to do what they're doing.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a good point. This Texas incident came up in a conversation I had offline, just on the phone with the Moriartys yesterday. Texas is certainly a state that is very concerned with individuals' rights and the rights to protect yourself and everything. So the Dallas Morning News, which you and I have spoken about extensively in our conversations about the JFK assassination, we've come to be good friends over the years that we've known each other, Jared, and I enjoy having you on the show, not only for your legal expertise, but for your personal integrity as a stand-up guy who just does not take crap from anybody. And this is a really interesting case in Dallas. The lieutenant governor, I believe, paid the fine. The woman who owns the salon used the argument that her business is essential for supporting her children and her family. It's a legitimate argument. It's another question. What gives these governors the right to decide what's essential? A lot of people have objected to the decision that booze and weed are essential, but people are getting arrested for going to church. It's a valid point.
Right. It's a very valid point. It's a very valid defense in her case. And I think it's a very valid challenge in those cases where businesses or citizens are suing the state directly. I would just say this from the standpoint of the governors, they are acting under their emergency powers as the chief executive of the state. And traditionally, the chief executive is given a certain set of circumstances under which he or she can issue orders for the protection of the community, or for dealing with a natural disaster, or dealing with an invasion, things like that. And they're basically taking advantage of those provisions to issue these executive orders under a declaration of emergency that have the effect of forcing businesses to shut down, forcing people to wear masks, forcing people to social distance, forcing people to stay at home. And the question that's not being answered or being discussed, certainly anywhere in the mainstream media, is number one, whether there is a legitimate condition or circumstance justifying the use of these emergency powers. And number two, if indeed there is an emergency, whether the measures taken are narrowly tailored in responding to the pandemic. So a lot of unanswered questions are floating around these executive orders that we're seeing from the states.
Yeah, and I can tell just from the way you're speaking, some of the words that you're choosing are specific to legal language, narrowly tailored has a specific meaning. In other words, even if there is a set of laws or statutes or a state or whatever kind of constitution that defines this type of activity, you can't just say, well, there's an emergency, so since I'm the governor, I own your house now, right?
Right.
What does narrowly
Exactly.
tailored mean in this context?
It means that the actions taken, if indeed they have the effect of transgressing ordinarily exercised rights, for example, the right to walk down the street without a face mask on, or the right to go about your business and earn a living. I mean, really basic rights. The concept is that you do no more than is reasonably necessary to address the circumstance that is giving you these executive powers to begin with. So you don't get free rein as governor just because there's a pandemic to do whatever you want, because it might bear some relation to this virus that's supposedly going around.
Right.
You actually have to make a careful study of the problem. You have to rely on experts and scientifically considered understandings. And then when you're looking at the solutions and the measures that you're ordering, those themselves have to be studied and scientific, and not the product of arbitrary line drawing. For example, the question I always have is, where did they come up with this 6-foot number?
Right.
Okay, where is the scientific study that shows that 6 feet is the optimal amount of social distancing that has to be followed? Why not 7 feet? Why not 5 feet? I mean, these are important questions if we're actually going to restrict the ability of people to walk around in public or go into a store or leave their house. But I've yet to find an explanation that shows that this 6-foot number was arrived by some rational scientific process.
Right.
And
I mean, in your own life, if you go to a doctor and he gives you a diagnosis and then you go in, let's say, with an infection on your finger, and that doctor says, well, I think we need to amputate your finger, it's likely that you might say, this seems like a radical step. I'd like to get at least one additional opinion, if not many, before I take that irreversible step. Have we had that opportunity to question the recommendations of these so-called experts? I mean, we're thinking about, of course, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, heavily conflicted individuals with really, truly questionable pasts when it comes to this sort of thing. We've just been handed down their decisions and given no opportunity to question them or review them. It's quite a strange thing, isn't it?
Certainly feels that way. And I would say that in a functioning system, or a system that's functioning well, you would have a CDC that was issuing recommendations based on a transparent process, and then you would have some opportunity for the public in some forum to understand those recommendations and perhaps challenge them on the basis of conflicting expert opinion. Instead, as you mentioned, we've had these recommendations really handed down on us from on high by Fauci. And if you go to the mainstream media, which is supposed to be our functioning free press, but is in fact a 100% tool of propaganda at this point, there's of course no discussion or debate about the recommendations. Instead, they've jumped to the level that these recommendations are ironclad laws for saving your own life and the life of other people in society, and must be followed at all costs. And in fact, dissenters and people who have conflicting opinions, some of them extremely well qualified, well spoken, who've been making really incisive presentations into the nature of this coronavirus phenomenon and what actually might be going on behind it, those people are actually censored from having any voice in either the mainstream media or the mainstream social media. And in many cases, those YouTube videos that where a lot of these views have been set forth are being taken down. So I'd say exactly the opposite of a productive, fruitful, and democratic debate of how to address this pandemic. Exactly the opposite is what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's shocking to me because, we've got cases where microbiologists, epidemiologists, physicians of all kinds, they, as you say, have been totally cast aside. Their opinions have been not only not counted, but their professional reputations have been smeared. I'm thinking about Daniel Erickson. I'm thinking about Judy Mikovits. I'm thinking about Scott Jensen, the physician who is a state senator there in Minnesota. These are valid opinions, and these are not people who have been implicated in scientific fraud in the past in the way that Dr. Fauci has, the way that Dr. Birx has, the way that Dr. Redfield has at the CDC. At this point, it's beyond astonishing to me that these things are not widely known, not discussed, as you say, in the mainstream media, and being suppressed. The other thing that's come up recently in the mainstream media, if we can call the birdcage liner known as the New York Post media, it did report this story of a taser-wielding NYPD cop who punched a bystander, which is sort of an understatement, during a social distancing bust. Now, I've had some conversations with other law enforcement officials, retired. One of them is Mike Zullo, who people have seen on this show. We won't be seeing Mike Zullo here again. He apparently is in support of destroying the Constitution, thinks that this action was justified. But in our conversation, he refused to discuss this social distancing bust, spoke only about the segment of the video that's about to come up where this guy, who looks more like a thug than a cop, points a taser at a crowd. This kid walks up to him, doesn't look like a fighting stance to me, just walks right up to him, gets punched, slapped. Right here, he's on the ground, not resisting, two cops on him, punched again. I mean, this looks like police brutality to me, Jared.
Well,
Stepping on his head.
What it is. Exactly what it is.
Okay.
And I've seen that video before, and I've seen other videos of other instances in not just in New York but other cities where the cops appear to be beating the crap out of people, supposedly for either not social distancing or not wearing a mask, which is frankly not surprising to me, because when you think about it, these edicts, what are they really? They basically give, among other things, they give law enforcement sort of a blank check to go up to anybody
right
on the street. Just walking down the street, if you happen to encroach within 6 feet, which is quite a long area, if you happen to encroach, you're fair game for the police to start an investigation and arrest. So it's sort of like stop and frisk on steroids.
Right.
There's a guy in New York. I think you're familiar with him by the name of Lincoln Kareem, who's
Yep.
been doing some very, very interesting journalism in New York. He doesn't have the sort of man in the street approach so much as he goes out and just accumulates a lot of footage from outside these hospitals and this Samaritan's Purse. And he put up a video the other day of I don't know if that's the one there or it was out. It may have been outside of Chipotle, but he was basically demonstrating. Yeah, I think this is the one. He was demonstrating that the cops themselves were not social distancing
Correct.
with each other. And now you can actually see in that picture those cops are very, very close to one another,
Mask
and
off.
yet mask off. So these very important recommendations or edicts actually don't appear to apply to them, and yet they have a blank check to apply that standard to everyone else and potentially beat the crap out of somebody who may refuse to subject themselves to this type of enormous control, which is
Yeah.
what it is. So,
I mean, the fact is, the cops could walk up. I mean, here's another cop not wearing his mask, but these cops could walk right up to these guys and say, "You're not social distancing." I mean, they could grab them, arrest them. And the second you say, "Hey, what are you doing?" that becomes resisting arrest. They could start beating you down. They could get idiots like Mike Zullo to say, "Oh, you were in a fighting stance," and defend them. I personally think it is up to each and every officer who is involved in law enforcement when they see this type of activity to call it out among their fellow officers and stop it from happening, because really trust between the public and law enforcement is the first step to peace and civility. If the public doesn't trust the law enforcement, I mean, frankly, what that guy Francisco Garcia did put every police officer in the United States of America in danger, because anyone who feels disenfranchised or like the cops might beat them up could be pushed over the edge, could be frightened, could be emboldened to take some action. Not to mention, someone sitting in their apartment looking at all that, what's to stop them from opening fire on the cops? I think the first step is to maintain order. I mean, this is ridiculous. Lincoln Kareem is doing great work exposing the hypocrisy of these orders, the law enforcement, the hospitals, etc. People should definitely subscribe to Lincoln Kareem's YouTube channel, as you described, Jared. He's really mostly just documenting the situation. I personally love his commentary. He's another guy who doesn't take crap. He doesn't really appear on camera or interview people necessarily, but he will occasionally call people out, and they never have good answers for him.
Right, right. Well, it's interesting. I like that part of his videos, but he also has a knack for getting really interesting footage, because he's willing to plant himself outside of a medical installation for like an hour or 2 hours and use a very powerful lens to film without them even knowing it. Or he has these microphones that'll catch conversation as he's going by on his bike, I think it is. And, the things that he picks up are interesting tidbits of information that, on their own, they may not have a whole lot of meaning, but you can start to at least stitch something together of the truth of what's happening with this pandemic, rather than all of the fear porn that's just being promulgated by the mainstream media, and also these ridiculous people in social media who just clog up the airwaves by, just screaming about at the top of the lungs how we're being engulfed by this horrible virus, the likes of which humanity's never seen.
Yeah, for people who really want to dig into what Lincoln Kareem has been finding, he's got a sizable body of work here. He's created a huge document of evidence that when you look at it in total, I mean, even though I've been traveling around New York City myself, I've learned a lot, and he's also caused me to realize things that I saw myself, but I'm just seeing, a couple minutes here and there. I'm usually going out to go to a specific place to ask a specific question, and I'm out for an hour or something. As you said, he's really canvassing the streets. So just to get back to the legal question of the governor, where, Jared, can we look? First of all, we should talk about this. Why don't you tell everybody what this is and how it potentially applies?
Yeah. So this is one of the great landmark decisions of the Supreme Court, Ex parte Milligan, which came down during the Civil War. And it was a result of Abraham Lincoln having suspended the writ of habeas corpus because, in his view, the U.S. was in a wartime posture, and it should have the ability to hold people indefinitely and potentially try them in front of military tribunals for crimes against the Union. And these criminal defendants in, I believe it was Indiana, who were charged with conspiring against the United States on behalf of the Confederacy, actually found themselves charged in the military tribunals that the Union had set up. And they filed a writ of habeas corpus, which Lincoln had suspended.
What is that, the writ of habeas? Present the body, but what does that mean?
Right. Yeah, so it's an old English writ that long predates even the founding of America. And it's one of these very, very basic rights. I think you even find it in the Magna Carta, if I'm not mistaken. But it allows a person who is being detained in some capacity or imprisoned, in other words, being restricted by the state, to get a hearing to determine basically whether they are being held for just cause. So in our legal system, as it's developed, you often see prisoners using this writ to get their cases in front of the Supreme Court, even after they've been convicted at trial and gone through the appellate process and lost at the appellate process and been sentenced. They can still avail themselves of the writ of habeas corpus to try to get the Supreme Court to issue an order letting them go based on, you name it. It could be newly discovered evidence. It could be any argument that they feel may have been overlooked. It's not generally granted. I mean, it's a hard writ to get, but it's one of these fundamental rights that you're allowed to challenge the conditions of your confinement through the legal process. So when Lincoln suspended the writ during the Civil War, he was basically authorizing indefinite detention for civilians. Okay, and when you think about that, that's a pretty scary prospect and a pretty serious abridgment of a very basic right that we may not even think about in our day-to-day lives, but certainly you would think about it if you found yourself in a jail cell one day with no knowledge of what you were being charged with and no knowledge of when you were getting out. I mean, you'd be pretty grateful that there was at least this writ that you could pursue. Well, the Supreme Court ended up taking their case and finding for the prisoners and against Lincoln. And they basically said, even though we are in a civil war and the president does have some right to suspend the habeas writ based on the text of the Constitution, the fact that the civil courts, the civilian courts are still open means that you still have to try citizens in those courts. Okay, you can't just give them a military tribunal and sentence them based on that. You have to give them a legitimate criminal trial in the civilian courts so long as they're still operational. Very radical decision and a very, very strong statement by the Supreme Court holding up the Constitution against what it saw as overreaching by the chief executive.
Yeah. And so What does that say, Jared, to all the QAnon fans who have been telling us for 3.5 years that military tribunals are coming for all these alleged sealed indictments? Seems like that's nonsense.
It would directly contradict this decision. So if this case is still the law of the land and it's never been overruled, then any attempt to try civilians in a military tribunal is going to have a real problem under Ex parte Milligan and would be subject to the same challenge.
Right. And it's also nonsense coming from an anonymous source that's never been confirmed and has said a lot of things that aren't true. And if you question it or challenge it, you get attacked by endless sock puppet, fake named accounts, sock puppet accounts run by Kevin Shipp, sock puppet accounts run by Mike Zullo. It's an interesting phenomenon how that works. But so what can we do as New Yorkers? I know not everyone watching is a New Yorker, but I'm certainly very concerned that I can no longer enter the supermarket without wearing a mask. You and I discussed this as well. Some people will feel maybe it's not that big a deal to put on the mask just to go to the supermarket. What's the big deal? I keep having this image of Captain Picard in my head. I don't remember, wasn't it like the Borg was invading Sector 1 or something, and he says, the line must be drawn here. And I'm not wearing a mask to go into the damn supermarket because the next phase is they want to scan my hand and not let me in without the Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark of the Beast chip. Right. So what can be done?
Well, in terms of line drawing, I mean, that's a personal decision for everyone. And I think it depends on, what your level of comfort is with adopting this recommendation in your own life, how you feel about it. I mean, whether you have medical issues that might preclude wearing a mask as being advisable. I mean, I don't know. The evidence I've seen suggests to me that breathing in carbon dioxide all the time because you're wearing a face mask is probably not the best thing to do to boost your immune system. But I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to give medical advice on that. I mean, I wear a mask to go in a store if I have to, but I do it mostly for the comfort of other people there who may be very fearful based on the propaganda that they've been imbibing, and I don't want to get into a conflict with them.
And you've got children you've got to bring food home to, so you have different, I'm not criticizing anyone who's doing this. I understand everyone has different circumstances, and your primary consideration is to your wife and children. I'm just dealing with me. So, I mean, I got a box of storable food that somebody who wants to sponsor the show sent to me. I'll eat that before I put the mask on. I'll drive to Albany, but I don't know if they'll even let me do that.
Right.
I mean, I'm looking for solutions. The thing that comes to mind, Jared, is a mandamus lawsuit, but obviously that could take years. There's lots of ways that could get blown out. Can you talk for a moment about what that is?
Well, sure. And those cases are being filed, and I think that's actually a good thing. It's a good sign. It's maybe one of the few good signs that I see in the country at a time when there's many, many bad signs out there. But we are seeing a proliferation of litigation on behalf of people who have been economically harmed by the shutdown in places like, I know Pennsylvania just had a case filed yesterday where they're directly challenging the order as unconstitutional. Whether or you're actually seeking a mandamus as a remedy, or you're seeking some other type of remedy, such as a more standard injunction, or even damages. I mean, that's really going to depend on the particular legal machinery of the state that you're in. Different states have different rules, so I don't know exactly how the Pennsylvania case is procedurally postured.
Well, it looks like this morning, CBS News reported that the Supreme Court declined to lift the stay-at-home order. Is this what it was about?
Okay, so that's interesting. So these cases are moving pretty fast. I mean, that case was only filed a couple days ago. So the courts are reacting to these cases. Maybe they'll react in different ways. Maybe that decision can be challenged up to the Supreme Court if it involves federal rights being asserted against the Pennsylvania. Yeah.
When this article tells us it's the Supreme Court, do we know if they're talking about the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court or the?
If you scroll down a bit, let me see. The Supreme Court. It looks like it's that's actually the Supreme Court in. Okay, it says they filed an emergency request with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The state court sided with Wolf and rejected the challenge, and then they asked the U.S. Supreme Court.
Got it.
Okay, so you have different levels of appellate review. Oh, so it doesn't look like that one was successful. I know there's one that's just been filed in Florida. There's also cases, by the way, that are dealing specifically with the right to religious expression and the right to association that's been trampled on in situations where states are saying, I know Florida, Louisiana were states that said that you couldn't have religious services.
Terrible.
So that's another avenue of attack. Maybe that'll work its way up to the Supreme Court at some point. The Texas case, I mean, there's a case where it didn't arise in the course of a plaintiff filing a lawsuit, but it arose in the course of criminal prosecution. Looks like that case was successful because it made its way up to the Texas Supreme Court, and the lower judge was reversed, which I think it goes to this feature of the U.S., which is that we have so many different jurisdictions, and really we have 50 potential mini tyrants who can use the coronavirus to behave in 50 different tyrannical ways. Yeah. So that means there's a lot of different legal challenges that can be posed, but it also means that we're probably not going to get one unified, conclusive legal ruling that's going to stick for the entire country, if I had to guess.
Now, here's an interesting thing that's come up in the comments, Jared. Mark Bird says unlawful combatants are subject to a military tribunal. Mark Bird says you're incorrect, Jared. But again, when it comes to lawyering, it's just always, there's never an end really until somebody relents, because if we look up unlawful combatant, this isn't the law, of course, this is Wikipedia, we could look it up, but according to this, an unlawful combatant, an illegal combatant, or an unprivileged combatant is a person who directly engages in armed conflict in violation of the laws of war, or is fighting outside of internationally recognized military forces. So I don't know if this could be applied to somebody like Hillary Clinton, who, as far as I know, has never actually picked up a weapon to qualify her as being engaged in armed conflict. I think there's a lot of loopholes and ways around this. What's your feeling about Mark Bird's statement and this unlawful combatant thing?
I think it's an excellent point that's raised, because it illustrates something very, very important when we consider a case like the In re McMillan case that we're talking about, or In re Milligan, sorry, the Civil War case, because the legal understanding of our constitutional rights vis-a-vis the executive, vis-a-vis the executive's ability to issue orders or hold people or detain people in violation of something like habeas has actually shifted quite a bit from the civil rights era. I would say that this case, Ex parte Milligan, really stands at the apex of when the Supreme Court was actually willing to stand up and make a very, very strong statement enforcing the Constitution against the executive. And when you think about it, it may make sense historically, because that was a time when our country's executive was at a point of extraordinary weakness. We were literally fractured as a country into two halves. When you come to the present day, you're going through a period of history when a theory known as the theory of the unitary executive has really come to hold sway in Washington circles. And that theory basically goes something like the executive is the true seat of American sovereignty, and therefore should be the powers that the executive are allowed to exercise should be read and construed as broadly as possible in favor of a single solitary seat of authority. In other words, almost like a dictator. And actually, Attorney General Barr is very much associated with this theory. A lot of the neocons are. He actually gave a speech on this very recently in Washington. But a lot of the recent decisions regarding terrorists being held in Guantanamo and so forth, the concept of unlawful enemy combatants, those actually are a product of the shift to the unitary executive and the concept that the executive can basically do whatever it deems fit for the security of the United States. So there's a real tension there between that and this decision from the Civil War era, when I think we were a much different country. And I don't know if that's more of an argument that Hillary Clinton could be tried theoretically in a military tribunal, so much as an observation that what we're seeing in terms of all these governors exercising their powers very widely and almost by fiat is really an outgrowth of the way in which conceptions of power in this country and theories of power have changed dramatically from the Civil War era.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shocking thing and a surprising time. Every day, Andrew Cuomo is on the television, just giving his press conferences where he's pushing out these orders. The cops are enforcing them. It was interesting to note that the cops are enforcing these orders in Alphabet City. They're enforcing them in Harlem. I see people all over the place in Chelsea walking around not social distancing. Not to mention, in that video of Francisco Garcia beating down someone who doesn't appear to be taking a fighting stance, to me, I didn't see any tape measures. I didn't see any laser range finders. What evidence are these cops using to estimate 6 feet? I've met a lot of cops, including Mike Sulo, who seem to be pretty stupid. I don't know if they can just automatically judge 6 feet by looking. And when you get to court, it's your word against theirs. I don't know if you saw this video, but I was in City Hall Park last Friday, 1 week ago today, and a plainclothes cop without a badge told me he's a cop, told me to, go home. The park is closed. I asked him if he had a badge. He said no. I asked him how you can close the park in defiance of the Constitution. He told me to tell it to the judge, which I understood to mean they'd beat me up if I didn't follow what they were saying, throw me in jail until Monday, and then I could talk to a judge who very likely would not care about the Constitution, because if they did, we probably wouldn't be having the conversation in the first place. But it was a shocking incident for me, because really it began while I was standing in the park, really just speaking to this woman who doesn't look too dangerous to me. She's actually wearing a mask. I don't know, what's the law? If it's around your chin, is that, who's seen this law? I don't know. But does this lady look dangerous to you, Jared? Should we close down the park?
No, and just look, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but from common sense that I've, gained from just kind of being a human being and having a basic understanding of respiratory, airborne illnesses, generally closing parks isn't a great idea. I mean, you want people to get outside and get fresh air because the virus is most likely to be passed indoors. And in fact, that point of view, which I think is common sense, I saw supported in a video, I think it was on Journeyman Pictures, shortly after the the coronavirus stuff started, but it was the former head of Rockefeller University's um, Department of uh, Epidemiology and public health, something like that, expressed total shock and lack of comprehension at why this particular quarantine and social distancing policy and closing the schools policy is being pursued in a case where it's an airborne respiratory illness. Children tend to do very well with such types of illnesses. The passing of the virus. Yeah, that's the guy, Knut Witkowski, I believe.
Well,
Yeah.
but this seems to be a statement that was released. A lot of people are going to take issue with the Rockefeller University, but
Yeah.
this is interesting because this is a statement that they released. I haven't read it yet, but I'm willing to bet $1 that they're contradicting what he said. This says April 13th from the Rockefeller University, the opinions that have been expressed by Knut Witkowski discouraging social distancing in order to hasten the development of herd immunity to the novel coronavirus do not represent the views of the Rockefeller University, its leadership, or its faculty. So it seems like this is a guy who is perhaps a former associate of the university who's expressing his medical opinion, and if it's not in line with the collective, just like with QAnon, he gets tamped down, shut up, and people tell him,
Right.
don't listen to this guy.
Yeah, well, I followed up on his credentials because the video I saw, he seemed extraordinarily knowledgeable and well spoken, and very concerned with the direction our public health policies were going. And when I looked into his credentials, he didn't seem like a mere biostatistician. It looked like he had an extensive educational record in Germany, and then he had gone and had a position of some administrative importance at Rockefeller University, which I agree. When you hear Rockefeller, it should raise alarm bells. But I think the fact that he's no longer working there is actually a point in his favor. It's probably a
Yeah.
good reason to listen to him. And I think he said as much in the interview. He said something like, well, I'm either not working or no longer working for any government, so I can actually practice science. And he was very, very contemptuous. I really do highly suggest people try to track down that video if it hasn't been removed, because that was my first indication that something is seriously wrong with the way that this purported pandemic is being reported, as well as the way it's being addressed by our authorities.
Right. And it's interesting that Rockefeller University comes out and gets in front of Dr. Witkowski's statements that they don't agree with. He, according to that article we were just looking at, is the CEO of this Asdera LLC, which is Advanced Statistics for Drug and Diet Exploration, Repurposing, and Approval. I don't know anything about this, some kind of medical company, but I think it's a fair bet that when you come out with statements that are not acceptable to the collective, to the mainstream or whatever, they're going to say he's saying this because he stands to gain financially. Daniel Erickson is another doctor who has been very bold and outspoken in his statements, which I was extremely impressed by this guy. He gave a video press conference with a colleague of his, maybe it was about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and they've just been consistently coming under fire since then. Even the reporters who were in the room when they were giving this press conference were incredibly combative. There have now been a number of medical associations and things that have come out. They point to the fact that these two guys own an urgent care facility and that they're saying this to somehow financially benefit. I find it extremely ironic, Jared, that the same criticism, criteria, etc., not being placed on Dr. Fauci, who certainly stands to financially benefit if he is named as one of the inventors on patented techniques and technologies and things that are going to be integrated into vaccines that we're talking about. Not to mention Bill Gates, who is, essentially the vaccine king of crippling Indian children and sterilizing African women. Why do you suppose, I mean, this is a stupid question, forgive me for leading the witness, but why are they applying this double standard, Jared?
Well, they're applying a double standard based on a very simple concept: the in crowd versus the out crowd. The they we're talking about is the media. The media has its people that are its favored puppets and talking heads, and they're trying to turn this Fauci guy into a celebrity. I mean, it's disgusting. You've got this guy, what, they have people playing him on Saturday Night Live, that disgusting, odious organ of propaganda, which it's become. And then, the real scientific brains who are doing difficult thinking, like the guys you mentioned, or this guy from Germany, or the guy that David Icke had the interview with, Andrew Kaufman, I believe
Right.
his name is, who
Yep.
also has very provocative, interesting, not proven, but at least a plausible theory about how coronavirus may be linked in some way to 5G, which I found to be, if not 100% persuasive, certainly plausible and something that demands further study and scientific inquiry. But these people are being totally muzzled, ignored, marginalized because they don't buy or they contradict the narrative, which is essential to driving home the coronavirus operation, which is what it is. It's an operation.
Yeah. There was somebody who had posed the question, why isn't Bill Gates here? It's Vogue, which I understood Vogue to be a fashion magazine. I don't know why they're talking about one of the least fashionable, most uncool, nerdiest douchebags to walk the face of the earth. But Vogue magazine asks, why isn't Bill Gates running the coronavirus task force? Perhaps a more accurate question would be, why isn't the one person who stands to gain financially the most from coronavirus running the coronavirus task force? Seems like an obvious answer to me. What do you think about this being in Vogue magazine and asking that question?
Well, the question itself is very easy answers. I mean, starting with the fact that he's a college dropout and knows nothing about biology, not trained in it, not a doctor, not a scientist, a guy who his father was one of Rockefeller's trusted lawyers, and he got a very lucrative contract with IBM, on which his mother, I believe, served on some board of directors affiliated with IBM. So he got a sweet contract as a college dropout. Query if somebody with equal or better programming skills would have gotten the same contract without those connections. I don't think it's possible. I think he's a total deep state, a deep state creation and a deep state funky. That's my impression of him.
I think you might be right. I don't think I was aware that his mother worked at IBM, but
I don't know if she worked for IBM. I think she worked for a bank, but I think she was definitely part of some board that IBM had set up, and that was like the key connection to IBM that allowed him to get the contract to do their operating system, even though he was like a college dropout.
Right, and I don't even think he's
much like Zuckerberg. He's the forerunner of Zuckerberg, another college dropout who, there were a gazillion social media startups going around at that time, some which had been very big, but this guy was chosen to be the face for a pre-existing military intelligence project. I think it's starting to become more and more obvious the more time passes, and they basically shove these fake CEOs in our face, and they expect us to kiss their feet and listen to everything they have to say about how our lives are supposed to be run. And I think a lot of people are getting really sick of it. I know I'm sick of it. I know you're sick of it.
Yeah, and just real quick, I don't even think Bill Gates is a programmer. He definitely did not create MS-DOS. He purchased it from someone and then made a deal with IBM, which could be okay, but it's interesting the points that you bring up, and I'm interested to know more about that. There's something screwy going on there. Someone in the comments is telling us that Bill Gates paid to be in the magazine, obviously. That's definitely possible. I mean, we see how people, billionaires, own news outlets. We've spoken a lot on Crowdsource the Truth about Rupert Murdoch and how Fox News, the New York Post, and the Wall Street Journal are all controlled by Murdoch's News Corp. He's also got Sky News, I think, in the UK. This is a guy who is implicated in a hacking scandal, hacking into people's phones. I don't know if that's how you get news or if that's considered espionage. But while we're talking about CEOs, Jared, it was a surprise to most people when Bob Iger, the former CEO of Disney, stepped down. This happened, as I recall, right before the coronavirus outbreak really overtook the United States. This is reported by the Crap News Network on February 26th. What do you think about all these CEOs stepping down? Did they know coronavirus was coming? And if they did, why would stepping down help them?
Well, my take on coronavirus is that whatever is going on biologically and in the environment, potentially connected to 5G, I don't know whether that's true or not. I think it bears further investigation. But whatever is happening, it seems to be part of an operation, the purpose of which is to basically crash the U.S. economy. I mean, there is no better way to crash an economy than to shut everything down, make everyone stay inside, tell people they can't work, and create all these supply chain disruptions and shortages and restrict immigration and restrict trade. I mean, it's the best way you could possibly think of. So it seems, even if you only can get to do it for a month or two, or maybe a little more than that, that's still a lot of time, and it's a huge exogenous shock to the economy. And I don't think we really have a handle sitting here today on the true economic damage that's been done to our economy and really the global economy from this so-called pandemic. But I think once the enormity of the situation becomes clear, there's going to be a lot of economic distress that flows from it. So I think a lot of these high-level people have advanced knowledge of what's going on. They've been around the block. They know how our government and our systems of power work. And it's probably a good time to get out before companies start going belly up, which is already happening.
Yeah. And just back on 5G for a second, I've been kind of on the fence with some of this 5G stuff, only because some of the most vocal people I've seen speaking about it haven't had the best evidence. And although I believe there are dangers associated with it, there really are dangers associated with any technology that we use. And I could easily imagine at the time that they introduced the automobile, people who were interested in selling horses and horseshoes and buggy whips probably would point out that the cars are, you're going to drive around and crash into things and kill people and generate all this smoke that people are going to choke on. So I was holding out my judgment of 5G until I had more information. Something really troubling and interesting crossed my radar earlier today. We've been talking a lot about Charles Lieber, the Harvard scientist who was a world leader in nanotechnology, was indicted by the Department of Justice in January, along with let's see here, we've got Charles Lieber. He was indicted along with a couple of his students who failed to declare on their student visa applications that they were also members of the Chinese military. This is really interesting because nanotechnology is a field that I don't believe is widely understood by the general public, certainly not well understood by me. I don't own any nanotechnology that I'm aware of. I've never worked with it or encountered it. So we really don't have any idea what this technology is capable of. A Harvard Magazine article from 2011 was sent to me by an eagle-eyed viewer full disclosure, Jared is a Harvard graduate. I don't think you ever had anything to do with Charles Lieber or the nanotechnology that was going on there. But this is an article from 2011 specifically talking about virus-sized transistors. And it talks about, imagine being able to signal an immune cell to generate antibodies that would fight bacteria or even cancer. That fictional possibility is now a step closer to reality with the development of a biocompatible transistor the size of a virus. Now, it talks specifically about Charles Lieber, and it's talking about transistors that can turn on your immune system. This is 2011, so I mean, in terms of technology, this is literally a decade ago, and that is like a lifetime in the world of technology. It causes me to wonder, Jared, if in 2011 they were writing articles about this, it's fair to assume that the technology was well developed enough that they were publicly disclosing things about it. It also causes me to wonder if they can make a transistor the size of a virus. What's to stop them from filling flu vaccines with nanotechnology, injecting people all over the place? I mean, I walk around New York City back in the days when that was allowed, and I see every place you could imagine advertising, come on in here and get your flu vaccine. So what if they've been pumping people up with these, virus-sized transistors, and now a technology like 5G, which could send out an electrical signal that might trigger these devices to do something? How is that not a plausible explanation for something that many doctors are finding inexplicable?
Well, it's certainly something that I would want to look into more. I think that what this Charles Lieber at Harvard is accused of doing is nothing short of treasonous. I mean, by law, he was required to disclose any contact or relationship that he had with a foreign government because he was working on matters of national security under federal contract while at Harvard, taking a lot of money for it. And while he was doing that, he was taking a lot of money in Wuhan and working at the laboratory there, living, I'm sure, a lavish lifestyle because he was being paid enormous amounts of money under the table, by the way. It's really, I mean, it makes me very, very sad to think that somebody like him could reach really the pinnacle of his profession and become a tenured chair of a chemistry department at Harvard and yet not be fulfilled by that alone and feel the need to actually contract with a rival foreign government. Not only is it just extraordinarily greedy, but it's so disloyal to one's country. And for him not to understand or to be blind to it, there's just no excuse for somebody in his position with his intellect. And I think it's good that he's being prosecuted. Unfortunately, I think they're hitting him with a pretty minor charge related to what I think he should be charged with, which is treason. And that goes, I saw some pictures of Epstein up there as well. I mean,
well,
that
that's
goes
what I
for
wanted to bring
anybody.
up next. Let me just pause you for a second, because I want to pose a hypothesis. Not because I want to defend Charles Lieber, but for a moment, let's play the role of criminal defense attorney, because a lot of people on the internet cast aspersions on any attorney who would defend someone who is accused of a crime, basically treating that attorney like a criminal for defending the guy's rights. So if I were to presume Charles Lieber innocent until proven guilty, the first thing I might note, granted, we haven't seen any of the evidence, we don't have access to the man, we don't have access to the investigation, but for some reason when I look at this picture, Jared, this is a picture of Charles Lieber winning the Welch Award, which I've never heard of, but when I've won awards in my industry, I won a couple of International 3D Society awards for my work in 3D cinema and development of technology. You're pretty excited when you get your tuxedo on and you get there to the big party to win the award. This guy certainly looks like he can't contain his excitement. Charles Lieber looks to me like a man with the weight of the world on his shoulders who can't even muster a smile despite this obvious honor that he's receiving. And you also referred to this photo of Jeffrey Epstein standing here with Marvin Minsky. Now, Marvin Minsky was a guy who was he's like an AI expert, and I think he was particularly involved in the area of haptics, which is like kind of like controlling robots and stuff with, I'm not exactly sure what Minsky was up to, but he was into some pretty cutting edge technology with robotics and artificial intelligence. And it just causes me to wonder, what the hell is a loser like Jeffrey Epstein doing at Harvard? And is it possible that he might have concocted a scheme to entrap some of Harvard's greatest scientists, to force them to do things that they might otherwise not be willing to do, and sort of leave them with no choice, where they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't? And what if the activities of Charles Lieber weren't just the front for more sinister individuals who perhaps align themselves with blackmail specialists like Jeffrey Epstein, because they want to remove themselves from the direct execution of the crime so that a patsy like Lieber can take the fall while they stand there smiling like a dick, making billions of dollars, injecting us with vaccines and chips and all kinds of stuff. I just wonder. I don't have any evidence other than these photographs and speculation.
Well, it's a very interesting hypothesis. I would just make a couple of observations. One is this continuing theme of these college dropouts running the show. So Gates, Zuckerberg, and Epstein. They're all college dropouts, and yet they appear in the hallowed halls of Harvard at critical junctures, and critical responsibilities are assigned to them. The number two thing I would point out is that from my experience at Harvard, a lot of these professors, while they may be very bright in their narrow field of study, are often incredibly stupid when it comes to things that are governed more by common sense or common decency. I'll just give one example. I had a professor in law school by the name of Bruce Hay, who seemed like a fairly decent guy. He taught first-year contracts when I went to law school. He was a decent teacher. I did well in his class. About a year ago, I read an article. I think may have been the New Yorker or something like that, which contained a long article about how Bruce Hay, the professor, had become the victim in a long-running extortion scheme run by this woman and her transsexual partner, who had sort of entrapped him through promises of sex and a relationship while Professor Hay was going through a divorce. Yeah, there it is, the most gullible man in Cambridge. It's a fascinating read, but it kind of, when you get done reading it, you think to yourself, how could somebody in such a position with strong knowledge of the law and legal scholarship be just so incredibly stupid and gullible when it comes to this obvious extortion scheme that these very low-level fraudsters ended up perpetrating against him. He actually ended up losing his house, believe it or not. And I'll leave it to those who are interested in how that happened. I really suggest reading the article. It's kind of a cringe-worthy but a little bit fascinating story, just because it's just so bizarre.
I have an answer to your hypothetical question. How could someone so smart appear to be so stupid? The answer, Jared, is social engineering. Someone evaluates the target, finds the weak spot, goes in there, and entraps the person. We're all susceptible to it. And frankly,
Right.
we're all susceptible to being victims to it, which is why I talk about social engineering so often, because there are a lot of people who are trying to do this to all of us all the time. I suspect, including the dictatorial governor of New York, his jackass brother on CNN, and a variety of people who we've seen on social media, including, present company excluded, of course, some of the guests who have appeared on Crowdsource the Truth, who have attempted to socially engineer me and the audience. It's a dangerous thing that we have to constantly be on the lookout for. Jared, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening, particularly this late. It's been a wonderful conversation. We're going to continue to look for legal remedies to this oppressive, dictatorial overlording of the people of New York. Anything you want to say before we close out the show?
No, just everybody, I hope out there stays healthy and safe and sane during these times, because you know what's around the corner for us, who knows.
Yeah, nobody knows. Jared is the author of the book, What Happened to Bernie Sanders? We could almost have a sequel now, because this is talking about what happened to him in 2016. But people who are interested in following the thread can still get the book on Amazon and from other retailers. Additionally, if you find yourself in the South Florida area in need of a trial attorney, contact beckandlee.com. You can speak to Jared or his lovely wife, Elizabeth, and they're going to help you find justice. Jared, we'll have you back real soon. I appreciate you joining me tonight. And I want to remind people that I can't bring you shows on controversial topics like this if I were to rely on corporate sponsors who want to suppress alternative opinions from doctors, from lawyers, from documentary filmmakers, journalists, whatever people consider me to be. As long as they're not in line with the mainstream, there's no cash coming from mainstream sponsors, and I wouldn't want it anyway. I prefer to have the viewers sponsor the show, and that's why I've created this micro-sponsorship program, where for as little as $2 a month, you, the viewer, can buy back your ability to hear opinions, insights, and information that aren't necessarily in line with the mainstream. You're going to get access to a huge and growing library on patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. Jared, have a great weekend. Thanks everybody for watching.